The interesting facts about the Herero and Namaqua Genocide. The Herero and Namaqua Genocide is a historical event that occurred in Namibia during 1904 to 1908. The story of the Herero and Namaqua Genocide are not often taught in schools or colleges. This is because the story of the genocide is too complicated and difficult to explain to people who are not familiar with it. This video will tell you the interesting facts about this historical event. The Herero and Namaqua were two tribes in what is now known as Namibia. The two tribes lived on the land that would later become used by German colonists in 1884. By 1904 there were 5,000 German settlers, and 80,000 Namaqua and Herero people living in the area. Germany had launched a military campaign to subjugate the Namaqua people. The Namaqua were decimated by disease and battle, forcing them to retreat further inland. The German government decided to use a scorched earth policy, wiping out all of the Herero and Namaqua people living in southern Namibia. This policy was implemented through concentration camps, mass killings, starvation, and the poisoning of water sources. The first documented use of chemical weapons in warfare was the gassing of Kurdish civilians and soldiers by the Turkish military in Van, Iraq, on August 16, 1915. The attacks were part of the broader chemicals weapons program organized by Talat Pasha to disperse Kurdish dissidents across the Ottoman Empire. European countries recognized that some chemical agents might be used as weapons, and some took measures in the late 19th century. In 1878, France used sulfur mustard on jihadists of the Jangal movement who were imprisoned in Syria. The first large-scale use of chemical weapons as weapons was by German forces during World War I. The earliest large-scale use was against Russian forces and civilian population in 1914. In October 1918, during the German Spring Offensive, they used phosgene gas to cause mass casualties. It was first used on April 22, 1915. The use of chemical weapons is prohibited by treaties signed by most countries, including all European states and many other nations around the world. On July 1, 1997, the United Nations Security Council adopted and proclaimed Resolution 687 declaring that chemical weapons are illegal. Here's a list of some of the trophies from the Herero and Namaqua Genocide. The Herero and Namaqua Genocide is one of the worst genocides in history. The Herero were a semi-nomadic, pastoralist people living in what is now Namibia and the central part of South Africa. The Herero people resisted German colonial expansion into their territory, with the help of other African tribes, and had fought against German forces since 1884. This led to an intensification of German military force for decades to suppress resistance, culminating in the Herero Genocide, which began on November 12, 1904. With an order of General Lothar von Trotha to exterminate all men over 15 years old in Ondobik settlement area. It was ended in 1907, with the German colonial military commander Otto von Bismarck reducing the number of deported Hereros from 60,000 to 15,000. Khoikhoi people also suffered severely as a result of ethnic cleansing and displacement. The colonial authorities offered the Khoikhoi people a large territory in exchange for their continued cooperation, but they refused to move. In 1906, the German colonial army in Southwest Africa comprised just under 10,000 men. By 1914 the local force had increased to nearly 50,000. The Herero and Namaqua people were used as auxiliary labor to build railways. They were subjected to forced labor and conscription. The Khoikhoi people built artificial waterways to the sea in order to facilitate agriculture and transport. In 1908 an uprising against German rule was put down with great violence, especially directed against women, children and the elderly. Between 1904 and 1908, Britain and Germany fought a minor war in what was known as the Fashoda Incident. In the final stage of its development, German colonialism turned from a strategic colonial policy into an elaborate system of exploitation. The British/Boy and German examples may help to illustrate that the terms conquest, subjugation and coercion, which can be found in most dictionaries, are insufficient for understanding European colonialism. These three words do not capture the totality of what went on in Africa and other places during this time. The word exploitation, in this context, captures the totality of European colonialism. Many argue that this transformation was necessary to maintain the colonial system. This transformation led to an intensification of labor relations. In general terms, the British and Germans conquered land, enslaved their inhabitants, and coerced them with economic policies. What the Herero and Namaqua Genocide reveals about human nature. The Herero and Namaqua Genocide is one of the most well-known examples of ethnic cleansing, which was a systematic attempt to eliminate an entire ethnic group. The Herero were indigenous people who lived in Namibia until German colonialism in 1884. The Germans wanted to make use of Namibia's natural resources for their own benefit and targeted the indigenous people who occupied the land. They used tactics of forced labor and terror to take over the land, creating conditions that led to famine, disease, and death. 140 years after the Herero and Namaqua Genocide, what's changed about humanity? In the late 1800s, the Herero and Namaqua tribes in Africa were decimated by German colonialism. In an effort to gain control of the land, Germany invaded and killed over 1 million people. In recent decades, there has been a shift in humanity's ethical understanding of genocide. This is largely due to the community efforts that have been put forth by survivors of the Herero and Namaqua Genocide. These survivors have helped to bring about change in society as a whole, but also within Germany itself. The Herero and Namaqua Genocide is important because it sheds light on how much humanity has changed since then 140 years ago. The genocide occurred because of the imperialist project in the late 19th century. This was a period of colonization when Europeans came to Africa and took land from the indigenous people there. The genocide was carried out by German soldiers and settlers in what is now Namibia and much of present-day South Africa. The German government tried to conceal their crime by boiling the victims' bodies and dumping the remains in a river. However, a few survivors managed to escape and told their story, which is what led to Germany being accused of committing genocide. It was largely an attempt to maintain the power balance in Africa. The British government legalized apartheid in 1948. The South Africa government used the policy to segregate the black and white races and historically oppressed the Africans. The South African government was a racist one that segregated everything from neighborhoods to schools, hospitals, parks, etc. Even after apartheid ended, racial barriers still existed within education, employment, and healthcare. The British government used their power in South Africa to maintain their own power and influence. The British government had a goal of dominating South Africa and ruled it as they saw fit until 1948, when South Africa gained its independence.